The auditorium sinks into darkness. Then 4 notes ring out, clear, compact, like a bolt of lightning tearing across the sky of 20th century rock. Smoke on the water. The reflex is almost immediate. The world calls the name Ritchie Blackmore. The guitar, the riff maker, the symbol of fire and speed. But if we stay a few more seconds, if we do not only hear the surface, we begin to realize that behind that lightning bolt lies a dense, dark layer of sound, coiling like storm clouds. The Hammond does not cut in to show off. It does not chase after the guitar to keep up. It stretches the chords, expands the space, keeps the structure from collapsing under the weight of the very energy the band creates. Deep Purple was never just about speed. What they built was not merely noise. It was an architecture of sound, where each harmonic layer supports another, where tension is tightly controlled rather than exploding without direction. And the one who laid the foundation for that architecture was not the one standing in the spotlight. He sat behind the keyboard, almost motionless amid the stage smoke and the harsh glare of lights. Jon Lord. In a band where the guitar was often exalted as the ultimate weapon, he brought with him an instrument that belonged to churches and concert halls. Then he drove it through Marshall amplifiers until it roared, not to compete with the guitar, but to widen the sky in which the guitar could blaze. If the riff is the lightning, then Jon Lord is the sky where the lightning appears. If the guitar is the flame, he is the space that gives that flame shape, depth, and limits. Deep Purple, therefore, was not merely the explosion of early 70s hard rock, but a structure built with thought. To understand that, we must leave the stage and return to a quiet room in England in the 1940s. Before the smoke, before the riffs, before the nights that shook concert halls, there was a boy sitting at a piano, studying Bach and Beethoven with almost absolute concentration. Not a rocker straying into classical music, but a classical mind stepping into rock. And it was that very mind that quietly transformed the sound of a generation from within. Jon Lord was born in 1941 in Leicester, England, in an era when Europe still carried the after-echo of war. There were no stage lights, no Marshall amplifiers, only small rooms, sheet music printed on paper, and a family in which music was not a dream, but a part of daily life. His father was a jazz saxophone player, not a major star, but enough for young Jon to understand that music was not merely entertainment. It was language. It was structure. It was a way of thinking. From a very early age, he was exposed to rhythm, to harmony, to the freedom of jazz, yet at the same time placed within the strict discipline of classical piano. The first lessons did not speak of explosive emotion. They spoke of technique, of hand positioning, of how a theme is developed, of how a melody returns in another form. Bach taught him about structure. Beethoven taught him about controlled drama. Nothing was accidental. Nothing existed merely to be repeated. Unlike many rockers of his time, who learned music by ear, through clubs, through rebellion, Jon Lord was formally trained. He understood a score the way an architect understands a blueprint. He could see harmonic layers stacked upon one another, the internal movements between voices, the tensions that needed to be resolved at precisely the right place. So when rock and roll began to explode in England, he did not slip into it like a gust of wind. He stepped in fully equipped, not to abandon classical music, but to see whether that structure could survive in a louder environment. His thinking did not stop at a riff repeated until the audience screamed. He thought about development, about dialogue between instruments, about how a solo could take the shape of a fugue. Rock, for Jon Lord, was not the destruction of structure. It was an opportunity to test structure in another space. And at this point, the foundation had already been laid. Deep Purple would later not have a keyboardist who accidentally discovered an interesting distortion sound. They had a classical musician seeking to expand the borders of the very education he carried with him. Jon Lord did not become a rocker because he abandoned classical music. He became a part of rock because he brought classical music into it with him. By the late 1960s, as rock grew bigger, louder, and faster, very few believed that an organ could survive in that environment. The Hammond C3 had been born for churches and jazz clubs, places where the sound was round, warm, and disciplined. But in Jon Lord's hands, it entered an entirely different space. He did not plug the Hammond into a clean, polite system. He ran it through Marshall amplifiers, the kind usually reserved for Ritchie Blackmore's guitar. The volume was pushed to the point where distortion began to appear. Not a technical flaw, an aesthetic choice. Distortion on the organ created a sound unfamiliar to rock audiences at the time. It was not sharp like a guitar. It was thick. It had body. It felt like a mass of sound with physical weight. When the guitar tore through the air with high notes, a Jon Lord's Hammond filled the lower space with sustained chords, heavy as storm clouds. More importantly, he did not play like an accompanist. In Deep Purple, the keyboard was not decorative background. It was an equal voice. When the guitar launched a riff, the organ responded with an expanded harmonic phrase. When the guitar accelerated, the organ did not retreat. It widened the space so that speed could find its footing. The difference lay in mindset. Jon Lord did not think in terms of repeated riff. He thought in terms of structural development. In Child in Time, the opening contains almost no explosive drum beat. The organ sounds first, slowly, stretching each chord as if erecting a wall of sound. That is not a simple intro. It is a process of charging the air. When Ian Gillan's voice climbs higher and the guitar begins to scream, the entire storm remains standing because the foundation has already been laid. Listen closely, and you will notice that his movement between chords is not accidental. There is preparation. There is tension built and then released. His classical foundation allowed him to know exactly when to hold and when to let go. In Highway Star, the crossover becomes even clearer. The organ solo is not merely a display of speed. It carries the shape of a condensed fugue, a motif repeated, developed, transformed, intensifying according to an internal logic very close to Bach. Amid the frantic velocity of hard rock, a classical structure is operating quietly. This is the crucial point. Jon Lord did not try to make the organ sound like a guitar. We turned the organ into something else, thicker, broader, more architectural. If the guitar is the sharp line of a building, then the organ is the foundation and the load-bearing walls. Because of that, Deep Purple's sound was never thin. It had three-dimensional depth, texture, layers, space for each instrument to exist without canceling the others out. And at the first layer of the central question, the answer becomes clearer. If the riff is the lightning that makes the hall flare with light, then Jon Lord is the charged sky in which that lightning can appear. Without the sky, thunder is only a solitary explosion. With him, it becomes a phenomenon. In 1969, when hard rock was still shaping its own identity, Jon Lord put forward an idea that many in the rock world considered too daring. A concerto. Not a classically tinged intro. Not a few string passages inserted to create an artistic veneer, but a three-movement work, fully written for rock band and symphony orchestra. Concerto for Group and Orchestra. The night at Royal Albert Hall was not merely a concert. It was a statement. On stage, Deep Purple stood beside a full symphony orchestra, not to compete, not to prove rock was sophisticated, but to see whether those two worlds could coexist within a shared structure. What mattered was that Jon Lord did not do this to seek recognition from the classical establishment. He was not trying to make rock appear more refined in the eyes of skeptics. He did not want to elevate rock onto a pedestal. He wanted to erase the boundary between two spaces long considered opposites. In that concerto, the band was not dissolved into the orchestra. The guitar remained sharp. The drums remained powerful. The Hammond still roared. But behind them, the strings expanded the sonic field in a way a four-piece band never could. It was an ambition of space, something Jon Lord had always pursued. Yet that ambition did not fully align with every member. Ritchie Blackmore, with his instinct for strong and minimalist riffs, did not always feel comfortable within extended symphonic structures. He wanted more direct energy, shorter, more focused. This was not a personal conflict. It was two different musical philosophies. One sought strength in the concision of the riff. The other sought depth in expanded harmony. One was fire, the other was architecture. And it was precisely that tension that kept Deep Purple from ever becoming a one-dimensional band. Concerto for Group and Orchestra may not have become a commercial template, but it left a deep imprint. Progressive rock in the years that followed, from long, multi-movement structures to symphonic ambition, carried something of that spirit. Symphonic rock was no longer unthinkable. It had been tested seriously within one of the greatest hard rock bands of the era. Jon Lord was not a dreamer detached from reality. He was a classical musician living inside a rock band, and he did not want to choose one over the other. He wanted both to exist within the same composition. While the world began associating Deep Purple with speed and aggression, Sir Jon Lord quietly held onto a broader vision. That rock could contain within it the structure of a symphony without losing its power. And it was there that the seed of an underlying tension was sown, between stronger riffs and wider harmonies. In the early 1970s, Deep Purple entered what is considered the peak of their commercial and artistic phase. Machine Head was released. The sound became tighter. The riff became more central. The energy more direct. Pure hard rock. Here, Ritchie Blackmore's philosophy almost took precedence. Minimalist, sharp-edged. A riff strong enough could carry an entire song through 4 minutes without the need for complication. The guitar led the way. The rest served that structure. But behind those martial walls, Jon Lord was still thinking according to a different logic. He heard not only the riff, but also the harmonic layers that could expand around it. He did not reject the power of concision. He simply believed the structure could be broader, thicker, more layered. That difference did not erupt into scandal. There were no public declarations, but in the studio and on stage, it was clearly present. One side sought tension from the space between notes. The other sought tension from the layering of harmony. Blackmore might want to strip away excess to keep the energy from thinning out. Lord tended to add internal movement, extended chords, subtle runs beneath the main riff. The two directions did not cancel each other out, but they created friction, and that friction generated electricity. Listen to Highway Star or Lazy, and you can feel it. The guitar drives forward like an arrow. The organ does not block it, but it does not stand still either. It swirls around it, expands it, sometimes almost challenges it. This was not a personal battle. It was two musical philosophies trying to coexist within a shared structure. Theo, what matters is this. Deep Purple did not succeed despite the tension. They succeeded because of it. Their music possessed a particular kind of intensity, not only because of speed, but because within it existed two opposing forces. The riff wanted to move straight ahead. The harmony wanted to expand. One pulled forward, the other pulled outward. The result was a mass of sound both focused and vast. If everyone in the band had thought alike, perhaps Deep Purple would have become simpler, or softer, or louder but shallower. Instead, they became an architecture of sound with inner strength, because within it, there was always a quiet debate. Not enemies, not rivals, but two different understandings of the power of rock. And in the tension between riff and harmony, the sound of a generation was shaped. In 2002, after more than 30 years with Deep Purple through multiple lineups, Jon Lord made a decision that surprised many because it was too quiet. There was no internal crisis, no noisy farewell, no mutual criticism in the press. Just a brief announcement. He would leave the band to focus on other projects. But behind that simplicity lay a long process. In his final years with Deep Purple, Jon Lord seemed to have entered a state of reflection rather than conquest. He still played powerfully. He still held a foundational role in the band's sound. But his gaze was no longer directed entirely toward the front of the stage. He returned to unfinished drafts, to symphonic ideas left incomplete since the 1960s, to compositions where the Hammond did not need to roar in order to exist. If in the early phase of his career, he brought classical music into rock, then at the end of his journey, he brought the experience of rock back into classical music. His solo works after 2002 were not attempts to prove he belonged to the symphonic world. He no longer needed that. Instead came compositions of a subdued, almost spiritual tone, extended structures where themes developed slowly, no rush, no need for applause. That music had space to breathe, silence between notes. The depth of someone who had passed through thousands of loud nights on stage and understood that strength does not reside only in volume. For many rock artists, leaving the big stage means decline. But for Jon Lord, it was an intentional transition. He was not pushed out of the spotlight. He stepped out. And that says a great deal about the man. A musician who helped create some of the heaviest sonic masses in hard rock chose to spend the final chapter of his artistic life in stillness. No more roaring Marshall amps, no more tense dialogue between riff and harmony. Instead, strings, piano, and expanded harmonic lines true to his original education. This moment completed the circle. The boy who studied Bach and Beethoven did not disappear when he became a rock star. He merely stepped temporarily into another chapter. And when that chapter closed, he returned to his point of origin, but with an experience no concert hall could ever teach. In an industry that glorifies endurance and the repetition of old legends, Jon Lord chose the opposite. He did not try to compete with his own past. He did not turn himself into a living museum of Deep Purple. He chose silence over spotlight, and for a man who always thought in terms of structure, perhaps he understood very clearly. Every symphony needs a final movement, not with an explosion, but with a descent into quiet at the right moment. In a band where the guitar was exalted as a symbol, where the voice often commanded all attention, Jon Lord was never the frontman. He did not step to the center of the stage to raise his instrument high. There were no performances designed to capture the cameras. No construction of a rock god persona with its own mythology. He sat behind the Hammond, focused, almost detached from the rest of the stage. But his influence did not lie in where he stood. It lay in how he changed the role of the keyboard in rock. Before Jon Lord, the keyboard in hard rock was often a background layer, adding color, adding atmosphere. After him, it became an equal force. Hard rock and metal keyboardists who followed no longer thought only about accompanying chords. They thought about dialogue, about distortion, about creating their own wall of sound. In progressive rock, the concept of extended structures, multi-movement development, expanded harmony, the very things Jon Lord had experimented with, became foundational. Rock was no longer confined to the framework of 3 minutes and a central riff. It could be a journey. It could be architecture. And in symphonic metal, where strings and guitar coexist within the same space, the spirit of Concerto for Group and Orchestra remains present. Not as a direct copy, but as a door opened very early on. What is remarkable is that Jon Lord never declared himself a pioneer. He did not retell that story in a self-glorifying way. There was no grand personal marketing strategy, no effort to position himself as the father of keyboard metal. He simply did his work. And perhaps it is precisely the absence of flamboyant ego that made his legacy more enduring. It is not tied to an image. It is tied to sound. Deep Purple is still remembered for its iconic riffs, but if one listens carefully, one hears the layer behind them, the element that creates depth, that keeps the entire structure from collapsing under the weight of the very energy the band generates. Jon Lord proved something rare in the world of rock. Power does not have to occupy center stage. It can reside in the foundation, in sustained chords. In the structure, the audience does not see but always feels. Not every architect lives inside the building he designs, but if the building still stands, his imprint remains. And in the sound of a generation, Jon Lord remains there, not loud, not claiming the spotlight, but indispensable. When people mention Deep Purple, the first thing that usually appears is a riff. Sharp, compact, immortal. And the name that accompanies it is almost always Ritchie Blackmore. But after all the chapters we have passed through, the central question gradually becomes clearer. If Blackmore created the lightning bolts, then who created the sky? Jon Lord did not write the most memorable riffs in rock. He did not stand at the center of the frame. He did not build a personal mythology around himself, but he created the space in which those riffs could exist. He created the depth, so the sound would not thin out over time. He created the structure so the energy would not self-destruct in its own explosion. He created the sky for the thunder. Deep Purple, therefore, was not merely the noise of an era, not only speed, martial amps, smoke, and lights. It was an architecture of sound, where each harmonic layer was placed precisely, where tension was controlled, where the collision between riff and harmony generated electricity. And within that architecture, Jon Lord was not the man standing on the balcony. He was the one drawing the blueprint. Some artists are remembered because they stood at the center of the stage. Some are remembered because they screamed louder than anyone else. Jon Lord is remembered because he listened more, because he understood that the power of rock does not lie only in volume, but in the structure behind that volume. He entered hard rock with the mind of a classical musician and left when the circle had closed. No scandal, no loud declarations, only a sonic legacy that still resonates whenever Child in Time opens with its sustained chord, whenever Highway Star shifts into a solo shaped like Bach. If you listen closely enough, you will realize Deep Purple is not only fire, it is the sky. And Jon Lord is the quiet architect of that sky. An organ roaring like a guitar, a classical musician stepping into the world of hard rock without losing his foundation. A man who did not compete for the spotlight, yet shaped the sound of an entire generation. If you love the real stories behind rock legends, not only the lights but the structure standing behind the lights, follow Icons and Legacies to continue discovering the quiet minds who built the sound of history.